The silver-plated hands of the cathedral clock did not simply strike midday. They sounded like a firing squad. A fraction of a second before the first iron chime reverberated through the vaulted stone arches of St. Jude's Basilica, the air inside had been suffocatingly sweet, clogged with the scent of 10,000 imported white lilies, heavy incense, and the collective perfumed breath of the kingdom's absolute elite. 300 aristocrats sat in the mahogany pews, their eyes fixed on the altar, waiting to witness the ultimate union of wealth and ancient title. But the moment the clock struck 12, the heavy oak ceremonial doors at the back of the nave didn't just open. They violently slammed against the stone walls, the echo cutting through the organist's processional like a blade. Before we look into the dark, staggering deception that was about to turn this fairy tale wedding into a crime scene, hello and the most heartfelt welcome to every single one of you joining our channel today. I am incredibly grateful to have you here with us. Take a quick second to drop a comment below and let me know exactly where you are watching from in the world. I absolutely love reading your responses and seeing how far our community reaches. How are you all doing today? If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Trust me, you do not want to miss a single second of the high-stakes, deeply emotional stories we bring to this channel every single week. Your support means everything to us, so subscribe now and join our growing family. Now let us step back onto that crimson aisle, where the ultimate betrayal was about to be unmasked in front of the entire world. Victoria Montgomery stood at the altar, her breath catching in her throat as a sudden, inexplicable chill swept through her silk bridal gown. Her fingers, trembling slightly, were laced through the strong, steady hand of her groom, William Darcy, the newly coronated Duke of Blackwood. For 2 years, William had played the part of the perfect, fiercely devoted suitor. He was a man of staggering architectural grace, brooding intellect, and an ancient lineage that held the keys to half the land in the realm. To the public, their whirlwind romance was a modern legend, the brilliant, self-made daughter of a shipping merchant marrying the most elusive bachelor in the aristocracy. Victoria had spent the last 24 hours in a state of pure, euphoric anticipation. She believed she was stepping into a lifetime of shared devotion, a partnership built on the deep, late-night conversations they had shared in William's sprawling estate library. The elite crowd in attendance watched with envious, predatory smiles, waiting to see the merchant's daughter officially take her place as the highest-ranking Duchess in the high society circles. But the woman who had just shattered the sanctuary of the cathedral didn't look like a wedding guest. She looked like a ghost seeking vengeance. She stood in the center of the doorway, framed by the blinding afternoon light. She wore no colorful silk or celebratory lace. She was dressed in a pristine, structured riding habit of midnight black velvet, her face stark pale beneath a lace veil that she violently threw back the moment she stepped inside. Her posture was regal, her chin held high with an terrifyingly calm authority that instantly made every aristocrat in the pews freeze in absolute terror. Yet it wasn't just the woman's sudden, dramatic intrusion that struck a mortal blow to Victoria's heart. It was the document she held high in her leather-gloved hand. It was an imperial certificate of marriage, bearing the golden seal of the High Chancellor. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the congregation. The woman didn't hesitate. She marched down the crimson carpet, her riding boots clicking against the ancient stone floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to an execution. She didn't look at the stunning floral arrangements. She didn't look at the panicked wedding coordinators who were frantically trying to intercept her. Her eyes, burning with a fierce, cold fury, were locked entirely on the groom. And then the final piece of the nightmare fell into place. "Stop this mockery immediately," the woman's voice boomed through the cathedral, a rich, aristocratic soprano that carried the absolute, unshakable authority of someone who owned the very ground they stood on. She stopped less than 10 feet from the altar, pointing her gloved finger directly at William's chest. "This wedding is a sham. This man cannot take a bride today, for he is already bound by law, by blood, and by sacred oath to another." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face, turning her a sickly, ghostly white. She slowly turned her head to look at her fiancé, expecting him to call for security, expecting him to laugh off the wild claims of an unhinged intruder. But William didn't move. The Duke of Blackwood stood paralyzed, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped beneath his pale skin. His knuckles turned completely white where they held Victoria's hand, but his grip was no longer comforting. It was a frantic, desperate vice. His eyes, usually so calm, analytical and commanding, were wide with a sudden, primal terror. He wasn't looking at the woman as if she were a stranger. He was looking at her as if his past had just crawled out of a grave to drag him into the dark. "William," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling so hard it barely carried past the heavy lace of her veil. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "William, who is this? What is she talking about?" Before the Duke could form a single word, the woman stepped onto the altar pews, thrusting the golden-sealed document directly between Victoria and William. "My name," the woman said, her voice dropping to a register of devastating, quiet clarity that echoed in the silence of the church, "is Catherine Darcy. I am the true Duchess of Blackwood. And the man you are standing next to has been my husband for the last 7 years." Victoria felt the world tilt. The trap had snapped shut. She hadn't stepped into a fairy tale. She had walked directly into a beautifully orchestrated execution of her own life. The grand tapestry of St. Jude's Basilica, with its soaring stained-glass windows depicting ancient martyrs, seemed to lean inward, suffocating the very breath from Victoria's lungs. The declaration hung in the air like a localized frost. 7 years. To the assembled lords, countesses and foreign diplomats, the unfolding scene was a delicious high-society scandal to be whispered about behind lace fans. But to Victoria Montgomery, it was the systematic, violent dismantling of her entire reality. To comprehend the sheer depth of the betrayal currently piercing Victoria's chest, one had to look beneath the silk and diamonds to the foundation of who she truly was. Victoria was not born to the manor. She was the daughter of Arthur Montgomery, a brilliant, self-made shipping magnate whose fleet of merchant vessels connected the kingdom to the wealthy trade ports of the East. Victoria had inherited her father's razor-sharp analytical mind and his unyielding work ethic. She wasn't a fragile flower raised in a drawing room. She had spent her youth learning the complexities of international trade, maritime law and financial ledgers. She possessed a rare, fierce independence that made her an anomaly among the high-born ladies who spent their days chasing titles. Yet, despite her formidable intellect, Victoria possessed a deeply hidden vulnerability. A profound desire to be loved for who she was, not for the vast commercial wealth her family controlled. When William Darcy had entered her life 2 years ago, he had seemed to be the answer to that unspoken prayer. William was the Duke of Blackwood, a man burdened by an ancient name, crumbling castles, and a brooding, intellectual intensity that mirrored Victoria's own. Unlike the shallow, opportunistic nobles who swarmed around her father's fortune, William had shown a deep, seemingly genuine interest in Victoria's mind. He had spent hours in her family's garden debating philosophy, discussing the economic future of the kingdom, and looking at her with a fierce, protective devotion that had slowly, completely captured her heart. "You are a breath of life in a court of ghosts, Victoria," William had whispered to her on the night he proposed, placing a heavy antique sapphire ring on her finger. "They only care about bloodlines and stolen crowns. But you represent the future. With your mind and my title we can change the fabric of this kingdom." Victoria had believed every single word. She had mistaken his brooding secrecy for the weight of ducal responsibility. She had rationalized his insistence on a relatively swift engagement and his refusal to introduce her to certain reclusive factions of his family as aristocratic eccentricity. She had loved him with a pure, unadulterated trust that left her completely defenseless. But standing on the altar, looking at the structural perfection of Catherine Darcy's features, the horrifying mathematical reality began to assemble itself in Victoria's mind. Catherine Darcy did not look like an imposter. She bore the unmistakable, effortless arrogance of the high aristocracy, specifically the House of Pendleton, a ruthless ancient bloodline that held immense political sway over the royal court. Catherine's eyes were a piercing, stormy gray, flashing with the cold certainty of a woman who had never known a day of rejection. William's hand in Victoria's went entirely limp, slipping away like water. He took a half-step back, his face transforming into a mask of hollow, gray despair. He didn't look at Victoria. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed entirely on Catherine, his jaw locked in a silent confession of guilt. "Catherine," William finally managed to speak, his voice a low, strangled rasp that sounded nothing like the confident nobleman Victoria loved. "What are you doing here? You were supposed to remain at the northern estate. This This matter does not concern you. Does not concern me? Catherine unleashed a cold, melodic laugh that sent a shiver down the spine of every guest in the front rows. You attempt to marry the daughter of a merchant in the capital's highest cathedral, using the Blackwood name, and you claim it does not concern your legal wife? You're a fool, William. Did you truly believe your little secret could remain hidden forever? Victoria stood frozen, her eyes darting between the man she thought she knew and the woman who claimed to own him. The sapphire ring on her finger suddenly felt like a brand of pure shame. She looked at the front pews where her father, Arthur Montgomery, was already standing up, his face twisted into an expression of raw, protective fury, his hand gripping the cane he used for his injured leg. "William," Victoria said, her voice dropping its trembling edge, replaced by a sudden, dangerous clarity born of survival. She stepped directly into his line of sight, forcing him to look at her. "Look at me. Is this true? Is this woman your wife?" William swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the cathedral as if looking for a way to rewrite reality. "Victoria, please let me explain. It's not what it seems. The marriage, it was an arrangement. A political contract forced upon me when I was a youth. We haven't lived as husband and wife in years. I love you, Victoria. Everything I told you was real." "An arrangement?" Catherine stepped closer, her velvet riding habit rustling like winter leaves. "Let us tell the merchant's daughter the true nature of your arrangement, William. Let us tell her why she is really standing here today. Before we discover the staggering, dark truth about why Victoria was chosen for this wedding, and what terrifying secrets the royal court has been hiding from her, I want to take a brief moment to welcome everyone watching. Stories of resilience, reclaiming your power from betrayal, and standing tall against corruption are what we love to bring to life on this channel. If you believe that a woman's intellect is her greatest weapon against those who try to use her, please hit that like button right now. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on William's cowardice. Does he deserve any mercy? And if you haven't subscribed yet, please join our incredible community today. Your subscription directly helps us produce these long, deeply detailed, high-quality narratives just for you. Now, let us return to the altar, where Catherine Darcy is about to rip away the final illusion of Victoria's fairy tale romance. Catherine looked at Victoria, her eyes filling with a cruel, patronizing pity that made Victoria's blood boil. "You were never his intended Duchess, my dear. You were his bank account. The Blackwood estates are completely insolvent. William's grand title was days away from being repossessed by the crown due to his family's massive debts. He needed your father's shipping millions to pay off his creditors, and he needed a pristine public wedding to convince the royal court that his house was still stable." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You were a carefully kept secret, Victoria. A pawn used to secure cash and reputation. He was never going to legally register your marriage certificate. You were going to be a shadow bride, kept in a secluded townhouse, while I remained the true Duchess of Blackwood in the eyes of the law. You were used little merchant girl. From the very first day." The revelation struck the sanctuary like a physical blow, fracturing the holy silence of the cathedral into 1,000 pieces. A low, ugly murmur began to rise from the pews, a gathering storm of whispers from the very nobles who, moments ago, had been preparing to toast to Victoria's health. Now their eyes gleamed with a predatory amusement. They looked at Victoria's pristine white silk gown and saw a joke. They looked at her family's wealth and saw an easy target that had been masterfully outmaneuvered by the old aristocracy. Victoria felt a cold numbness spreading from her fingertips, traveling straight to her heart. A shadow bride. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a terrifying mathematical precision. The private ceremonies he insisted upon, the legal documents his personal attorneys had prepared in secret, his absolute refusal to let her father's legal team review the marriage contracts. It hadn't been an act of romantic intimacy. It had been a cold, calculated campaign to ensure she never held a single shred of legal right to the Blackwood name or estate. "William," Victoria's father, Arthur Montgomery, roared from the front row, his voice shaking with a rage that vibrated through the stone floor. He forced his injured leg forward, slamming his heavy silver-headed cane against the marble steps of the altar. "You cowardly, blue-blooded parasite. I will tear your shipping concessions to pieces. I will bankrupt your entire house by sunset. You dare bring my daughter into this house of God to make a mockery of her name." "Arthur, please." William cried out, his aristocratic poise completely shattered. He took a step toward the older man, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture, though his eyes kept darting toward the cold, unyielding face of Catherine. It was the only way. The High Chancellor threatened to seize the northern ports. Your ports, Arthur. If Blackwood fell, your shipping routes through the Delta would have been revoked by royal decree. Do not use my father to justify your theft, William. Victoria's voice cut through the shouting like a razor. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a sob. It was a cold, quiet register of pure steel that made both William and Catherine snap their heads toward her. Victoria slowly reached up, her movements precise and unhurried. With a single firm tug, she ripped the heavy lace veil from her hair, tossing it onto the altar steps where it fell like a discarded shroud. Her face was completely exposed, pale, stark, but her eyes were twin fires of absolute lethal intelligence. Victoria, William whispered, stepping toward her, his face a mask of sweating desperation. You have to believe me. I grew to love you. The plan, it was supposed to protect everyone. Once the debts were cleared, I was going to find a way to dissolve the marriage to Catherine legally. I was going to make you the true Duchess. With what law, William? Victoria asked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. She took a step closer to him, her posture so commanding that the Duke involuntarily took a half step back. You are an expert on ancient titles, but you forgot that I am an expert on contracts. A marriage contracted while a prior legal union exists is not just voidable. It is a high felony against the crown. You didn't just lie to me. You attempted to use my father's signature on those financial dowry drafts to clear a debt that was engineered by the royal court itself. Catherine's eyes narrowed, the mocking amusement fading from her aristocratic features, replaced by a sudden, sharp curiosity. What did you say, girl? Victoria didn't answer her. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the back of the altar, where a high-ranking figure had been quietly watching the entire disaster unfold from the shadows of the bishop's choir stalls. Stepping out from the heavy velvet curtains, his crimson robes rustling against the stone, was High Chancellor Julian Vance. A collective breath caught in the throats of the congregation. The High Chancellor was the hand of the king himself, the architect of the realm's laws and alliances. He didn't look surprised by Catherine's dramatic intrusion, nor did he look panicked by the collapse of the wedding. His face was a mask of cold, serene calculation. The young lady is far more perceptive than you gave her credit for, William, Chancellor Vance said, his deep, clinical voice carrying across the basilica. He walked slowly down the altar steps, his eyes fixed entirely on Victoria, completely ignoring the weeping nobles and the rising chaos in the nave. It is a pity her bloodline does not match her intellect. Victoria felt a sudden, electric spark of realization flash through her mind. The trap went far deeper than a bankrupt duke needing money. William was a pawn just as she was. You engineered this, didn't you, Chancellor? Victoria said, her voice unyielding as she faced the most powerful man in the kingdom. You knew William was married to Catherine. In fact, you authorized their separation 7 years ago to keep Catherine's family assets insulated from the Blackwood debts. You allowed William to court me, you pressured my father to sign the maritime dowry transfers, and you tipped Catherine off to arrive at the exact moment the ceremony began. She took a sharp breath, her mind racing through the financial ledgers she had studied late at night. Because the moment my father's millions were transferred to the Blackwood estate account to clear the debts, a felony marriage announcement would cause the Crown to seize the entire asset pool under the Treason and Fraud Act. You didn't want to save the Duke. You wanted an excuse to legally confiscate my father's entire shipping fleet without firing a single shot. The entire cathedral went completely dead silent. The plot was staggering in its malice. A state-sanctioned execution of the wealthiest merchant family in the realm, using a fake wedding as the executioner's block. Before we see how the High Chancellor responds to being unmasked in his own cathedral, and what dangerous, desperate choice Victoria must make to save her father's life and her own dignity, let's take a quick moment together. The layers of this royal conspiracy are officially unraveling, and the stakes have just become life or death. If you are absolutely gripped by Victoria's brilliant mind and her refusal to back down, please hit that like button right now. Leave a comment below with the word conspiracy to show you're decoding this mystery with us. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please join our incredible channel today. Your subscription ensures we can keep bringing you these massive high-stakes emotional dramas every single week. Subscribe now and don't miss a single second. Now let us return to the altar, where Chancellor Vance is about to deliver a chilling ultimatum to the bride who refused to play her part. Chancellor Vance stopped just inches from Victoria, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his thin lips. He reached into his robe, pulling out a heavy parchment bearing the royal signet ring imprint. "You are entirely correct, Victoria," the Chancellor whispered, his voice dripping with venomous triumph. "But knowing the truth cannot save you. The dowry drafts were signed by your father 2 hours ago upon your arrival at the church. The funds are already in transit. And by the law of this kingdom, your father is now an accomplice to an illegal contract against a peer of the realm. You can either walk out of here quietly, broken and nameless and watch your family fall to ruin, or you can try to fight the crown. And I assure you no merchant has ever survived that battle." The High Chancellor's ultimatum hung over the altar like a guillotine blade. In the pews, the quiet, collective rustle of silk and wool sounded like the shifting of vultures on a branch. The very nobles who had drank Arthur Montgomery's imported wines and begged for cargo space on his merchant fleets now turned their faces away, eager to distance themselves from a family that had just been branded as state contraband. Victoria felt the heat of 300 pairs of eyes burning into her back, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of a single tear. Her hands, resting against the heavy cream silk of her skirt, curled into tight, rigid fists. Every instinct that had made her an expert in international trade, the ability to read a competitor's hidden tells, the calculation of risk in a volatile market, the cold patience required to survive a hostile takeover, snapped into a singular, razor-sharp focus. "You think you have won, Chancellor," Victoria said, her voice a low, melodic purr of pure defiance that cut through the space between them. She did not step back. Instead she leaned in, her eyes locked onto Vance's with a clarity that made the older man's predatory smile falter for a fraction of a second. "You think because you wear the king's seal you have accounted for every variable. But you made the classic mistake of a lazy monopolist. You assumed your target had no other options." She turned her back on him deliberately, her long train sweeping across the marble steps as she faced her father. Arthur Montgomery was breathing heavily, his knuckles white where they gripped his silver cane, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. "Father," Victoria said, her voice softening just enough to convey an absolute, unshakable command. "Take your hand off your cane. Do not give them the satisfaction of an angry display. We are leaving this house of brokers. Now." "Victoria, wait." William stepped forward, his hand reaching out blindly to grab her sleeve, his aristocratic face twisted in a pathetic display of genuine panic. "You can't just walk out into the capital. The Chancellor's guards, they have already positioned themselves at the carriage gates. If you leave the sanctuary of the cathedral without signing the waiver of indemnity, they will arrest your father for debt fraud before his foot touches the cobblestones." Catherine Darcy let out a sharp, mocking snort from the edge of the altar pews, crossing her velvet-clad arms over her chest. "Let them go, William. The girl is proud. Let her see what the world looks like when the Blackwood name isn't there to shield her from the mud. She'll be begging for a position as a scullery maid in my northern kitchen by the end of the winter." Victoria didn't even grant Catherine the courtesy of a glance. She stepped down from the altar, her arms slipping through her father's, supporting his weight with an iron strength as they began their long, agonizing march down the center aisle. Every step felt like walking through a gauntlet. To her left and right, countesses lowered their lace fans to whisper venomous mocks. Lords smirked, lifting their crystal glasses in a silent toast to her public execution. As they neared the massive oak doors at the back of the nave, the light of the afternoon sun was suddenly blocked by the silhouette of 4 heavily armed royal guards. They stood in perfect, unyielding unison, their iron breastplates gleaming, their halberds crossed over the threshold, forming an absolute barrier. "By order of the High Chancellor," the lead guard announced, his voice echoing coldly off the stone arches. "Arthur Montgomery is restricted to the cathedral precincts pending an immediate asset verification audit. No merchant property is to leave the sanctuary." Victoria felt her father's arm tremble against hers. The trap was fully deployed. They were prisoners in their own wedding clothes. But before the panic in the cathedral could boil over into a public arrest, a sudden, deep rumble echoed from the courtyard outside. It wasn't the sound of royal carriages or the shouting of guards. It was the synchronized heavy thud of iron-shod boots marching in perfect military discipline, a sound that usually accompanied the arrival of a standing army. The heavy oak doors were violently pushed wider from the outside, the iron hinges groaning under the force. The 4 royal guards were instantly effortlessly shoved aside by a contingent of massive stone-faced men wearing the distinct dark charcoal uniforms of the Independent Sovereign Guard, the private, elite military force that answered to no chancellor or king, but to the sovereign territory of the free ports. Stepping through the threshold, his long wool cloak billowing behind him like a cloud of smoke, was a man whose very name made the royal court tremble. It was Arthur Pendleton, ironically Catherine's estranged older brother, the legendary reclusive billionaire and commander of the free port fleets. He was a man who had completely severed ties with the corrupt royal court a decade ago, building a financial and military empire that controlled 80% of the trade routes entering the kingdom. A terrified, breathless silence fell over the entire basilica. Even the High Chancellor took a sudden, involuntary step down from the altar, his hands freezing inside his crimson robes. Arthur Pendleton did not look at his sister Catherine. He did not look at the Duke. His piercing gray eyes, cold as winter iron, swept across the ballroom-turned cathedral until they locked onto Victoria. He marched down the aisle with a terrifying purpose, his heavy boots clicking against the stones until he stopped directly in front of her, bowing slightly from the waist. "Miss Montgomery," Arthur Pendleton's deep, resonant baritone boomed through the silent church. "Your private courier reached my flagship at the mouth of the bay less than an hour ago. I believe you have a maritime trade contract that requires an immediate sovereign signature." Victoria's pale face broke into a small, elegant smile, a smile that sent a sudden mortal chill through the High Chancellor's veins. Before we find out the brilliant hidden countermove Victoria had prepared long before she ever put on her wedding dress, and how Arthur Pendleton is about to turn this royal trap into an international crisis, let's take a quick moment together. The tension is reaching an absolute breaking point, and the real game has just begun. If you are screaming with joy at the arrival of the billionaire commander, please hit that like button right now. Leave a comment down below with the word "Commander" to show your support for Victoria's ultimate counterstrike. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel right now if you haven't already. We have so many more twists, turns, and emotional payoffs coming your way, and your subscription ensures you never miss a single episode. Hit that button and join us. Now let us return to the cathedral doors, where the illusion of the High Chancellor's absolute power is about to be violently shattered by the true ruler of the seas. Victoria reached into the structured folds of her cream silk skirt, pulling out a small wax-sealed parchment that she had kept hidden from William since the dawn of their engagement. "Indeed, Commander Pendleton," Victoria said, her voice clear and perfectly audible to every terrified noble in the room. "The High Chancellor believes he has seized my father's fleet today through debt fraud. But he forgot to check the maritime registry. As of midnight last night, my father legally transferred 100% of the Montgomery fleet to the sovereign jurisdiction of the free ports as a private corporate merger with your firm. The Crown has no authority to seize assets that belong to a foreign sovereign power." She turned her cold, brilliant gaze back toward the altar, where Chancellor Vance's face was rapidly turning an ugly mottled shade of gray. "You wanted a shadow bride, Chancellor. But you just gave the free port fleet a legal reason to blockade your capital." The cathedral felt as though its foundations had suddenly dropped into a bottomless ocean trench. High Chancellor Julian Vance stood frozen on the altar steps, his hand clutching the royal parchment so tightly the ancient seal cracked into tiny, worthless fragments. Across the room, the whispers did not just stop. They died entirely, replaced by the heavy, terrifying realization that the borders of the kingdom had just been redrawn on the steps of a wedding altar. A merger. Chancellor Vance's voice lost its clinical serenity, rising to a harsh, strangled register that betrayed his mounting panic. He hurried down the remaining steps, his crimson robes flapping like the wings of a trapped bird. "This is high treason. Arthur Montgomery, you cannot transfer a strategic national infrastructure asset to a foreign sovereign power without a unanimous vote from the Royal Council. This contract is an absolute nullity." Arthur Pendleton took a single deliberate step forward, his massive frame completely obscuring Victoria and her father from the Chancellor's view. The dark wool of his cloak seemed to absorb the light filtering through the stained glass, casting an ominous shadow over the entire front row of the peerage. The Royal Council has no jurisdiction over maritime entities that operate in international waters, Vance, Pendleton said, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that rattled the crystal chalices on the altar table. The Montgomery Fleet operates under the Delta Concession Act of 1842, an act signed by the King's grandfather, which grants the Montgomery Line absolute territorial immunity in exchange for clearing the eastern trade routes. I suggest you consult your own legal archives before you use the word treason in my presence. Catherine Darcy stepped forward, her face twisted in a mixture of aristocratic outrage and deep-seated familial resentment. Arthur, what madness is this? You are a Pendleton. Your own bloodline holds the northern earldoms. How can you stand there defying the crown to shield a common merchant girl who attempted to steal my husband's title? Arthur Pendleton turned his head slowly, his gray eyes locking onto his sister with a cold, absolute detachment that made Catherine involuntarily step back. You lost the right to call me your brother 7 years ago, Catherine, Arthur said, his voice dripping with an icy, profound contempt. When you agreed to marry this spineless excuse for a duke, knowing that Julian Vance was using your union to secretly siphon the northern regional taxes into his private offshore treasury. You aren't a victim of this wedding, Catherine. You are a co-conspirator. You allowed William to court Victoria for 2 years, monitoring their letters, waiting for the exact day the merchant funds were transferred so you could swoop in and claim the spoils for your master. Victoria felt a cold sweat trace its way down her spine as the final horrifying layer of the conspiracy unraveled in her mind. She looked at William, who was now trembling so violently he had to lean against the marble altar railing for support. It wasn't just a bank account, was it, William? Victoria asked, her voice carrying a devastating clarity through the cavernous church. She stepped out from behind Arthur Pendleton, her cream silk dress rustling against the stones. The Blackwood insolvency wasn't an accident. You didn't lose your wealth through bad investments. You gave it away. You've been paying blackmail to the High Chancellor for the last 7 years. William buried his face in his hands, a low, pathetic sob escaping his chest. Victoria, I had no choice. If the truth came out about what happened in the northern provinces during the rebellion, the king would have executed my entire line. Vance had the documents. He had the signatures. He forced me to marry Catherine to keep the Pendleton family silent, and then he forced me to trap you. If I didn't deliver your father's fleet to the crown today, Vance was going to expose the Blackwood treason to the High Court tomorrow morning. The ballroom-turned-sanctuary erupted into absolute chaos. Members of the Royal Council who were sitting in the front rows stood up, their faces pale as ash, frantically looking toward the exits. The realization that the High Chancellor had been running a massive state-sanctioned extortion ring using the highest peers of the realm shattered the last remnants of court decorum. Before we see how Victoria uses this earth-shattering revelation to launch her ultimate counterstrike against the corrupt kingdom, and what dangerous, breathtaking choice Arthur Pendleton makes next to prove his absolute devotion to her, let's take a quick moment. The masks have officially fallen, and the true monsters of the realm stand exposed. If you are rooting for Victoria to burn this corrupt court to the ground with her brilliant intellect, please hit that like button right now. Leave a comment down below with the word revelation, so I know you're riding this massive wave of suspense with us. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please join our incredible channel today. Your support is what allows us to produce these long, deeply detailed 40-minute emotional journeys every single week. Subscribe right now and join the family. Now let us return to the altar, where Victoria Montgomery is about to turn her ruined wedding day into the dawn of a revolution. Victoria reached out, her hand locking firmly with Arthur Pendleton's in a display of unyielding unity that made William's chest tighten with an agonizing sense of absolute loss. She looked at the High Chancellor, her eyes flashing with the cold, brilliant light of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. You see, Chancellor, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a register of terrifying calm. I didn't just send a courier to Commander Pendleton today. I sent a full duplicate copy of William's extortion files to the international banking courts in the free ports. The Crown doesn't own my father's fleet, and as of 10 minutes ago, the free port banks have frozen every single asset account bearing your signature globally. You are completely insolvent, Vance. The announcement of the frozen international accounts didn't just stall the room. It seemed to violently stop the hearts of every high society parasite standing within the stone walls. High Chancellor Julian Vance looked down at his own fingers, his mouth hanging open in a hollow, grotesque silhouette of pure, unadulterated shock. His private treasury, the hoard of wealth he had spent a lifetime accumulating through blood, blackmail and state-sanctioned extortion, had just been rendered entirely worthless by a sequence of digital ink transactions executed across the sea. But a cornered predator is always at its most lethal. Vance's face contorted from an expression of clinical arrogance into a mask of raw, animalistic fury. His eyes rolled back slightly, his veins bulging against the high collar of his crimson robes. You think you can lock my gates, you arrogant merchant bitch?" he hissed, his voice dropping into a terrifying, guttural register that caused several nearby countesses to scream in horror. "You think an international bank contract can protect your flesh from a royal blade? Guards! To the altar! This is a state of absolute treason. Secure the girl. Execute the old man where he stands. I command it under the seal of the king." The response was instantaneous and catastrophic. The 4 royal guards at the threshold drew their heavy steel longswords, the sharp metallic ring of weapon steel cutting through the sacred vaulting of the basilica. From the shadows of the side chapels, an additional dozen heavily armored state operatives emerged, their crossbows raised, their iron bolts aimed directly at Victoria's chest. The sanctuary had officially transformed into a slaughterhouse. "Arthur, no!" Catherine Darcy shrieked, her aristocratic composure completely evaporating as she violently scrambled backward over the pews, her black velvet riding habit ripping against the mahogany wood. "Get out of the way. Let them take the girl. Don't let your stubborn pride destroy our entire house. The Chancellor will slaughter us all." William Darcy stood completely paralyzed against the altar table, his head shaking back and forth in a frantic, sweating loop of absolute cowardice. He had spent 7 years paying the blackmailer to protect his life, and now, facing the ultimate consequence of his submission, his spine collapsed entirely. He watched the blades advance toward the woman he claimed to love, and he didn't take a single step to shield her. But Arthur Pendleton didn't flinch. He didn't even draw his sword. With a single lightning-fast movement, the commander stepped directly into the path of the advancing guards, his massive frame forming an impenetrable, unyielding wall of muscle and dark wool that completely cut Victoria off from the line of fire. He raised his left hand high above his head, his fingers snapping together with a sound that cracked like a lightning strike through the cavernous church. "Sovereign Guard! Form the wall!" Arthur's voice boomed, a rich, terrifying roar that completely drowned out the shouting of the Chancellor's men. The 20 elite soldiers of the independent Sovereign Guard moved with a terrifying, mechanical precision that made the royal court look like children playing with toys. In less than 3 seconds, they formed a tight, impenetrable phalanx around Victoria, her father and the commander. Their heavy, interlocking steel shields slammed together with a deafening crash, creating an iron fortress in the center of the crimson carpet. The tips of their massive twin-pronged halberds projected outward from the steel seams, forming a lethal hedge of iron that brought the royal guards to a grinding, terrified halt. "Shoot them!" Vance screamed from the altar steps, his face completely purple, his arms waving wildly as he pointed at Victoria. "I don't care about the free ports. Shoot through the shields. Kill the merchant girl." The crossbowmen squeezed their triggers. A deadly volley of iron bolts hissed through the air, slamming against the interlocking shields of the Sovereign Guard with the sound of a violent hail storm. Several bolts ricocheted off the heavy iron plates, shattering the priceless stained glass windows behind the altar, raining shards of colored glass down upon the weeping, panicked nobles who were currently trampling each other to reach the rear exits. Inside the iron perimeter of the shields, the air was hot, dark and suffocatingly tight. Victoria stood perfectly still, her breath coming in shallow, rhythmic intervals, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at her father, Arthur Montgomery, whose face was dangerously pale, his breathing shallow as he leaned his entire weight against her arm, his injured leg trembling violently under the stress of the siege. "Victoria," her father whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, heartbreaking frailty that made her chest tighten with an agonizing fear. "I'm sorry, my girl. I wanted to give you a title. I wanted to give you the world. I didn't see the snakes in the grass. My fleet, my life's work. It's all turned to ash because I trusted a blue-blooded name. Don't you dare close your eyes, father, Victoria said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated steel that surprised even herself. She reached up, her fingers digging into his shoulders, forcing him to look into her burning eyes. You didn't lose anything. You built an empire with your own hands from the mud of the docks, and no corrupt court can ever steal the mind you gave me. We aren't going to die in this church. We are going to take their kingdom. She looked up, her gaze locking onto Arthur Pendleton, who was standing just inches from her within the dark enclosure of the shields. Even in the absolute darkness of their siege, his gray eyes burned with a fierce, protective intensity that sent an electric surge of absolute hope straight through her veins. He wasn't looking at her as if they were trapped. He was looking at her as a general looks at his queen before the final charge. The courtyard is completely surrounded by state infantry, Victoria, Arthur said, his deep baritone perfectly steady despite the sound of swords clashing against the iron shields outside. Vance has called in the city garrison. My 20 men can hold this line for an hour, but we are completely cut off from the harbor. The moment the heavy artillery arrives from the citadel, this cathedral will become our tomb. He reached down, his large, calloused hand warmly covering hers, his grip so fierce it nearly crushed her fingers. It was an admission of absolute danger, a moment of raw, naked vulnerability shared between two souls who had spent their entire lives relying only on themselves. I can break a hole through the eastern wall, Arthur whispered, his eyes boring into hers. But it means abandoning the carriage. It means walking through the fire, Victoria. Are you ready to leave the life you knew behind? Before we find out the brilliant high-stakes gamble Victoria is about to propose to turn this military slaughter into the opening salvo of a revolution, let's take an urgent moment together. The darkest hour has officially arrived, the sanctuary has been broken, and the blades are pressing against our heroes from every side. If your heart is absolutely racing right now and you are praying for Victoria and Arthur to survive this onslaught, please hit that subscribe button immediately. Leave a comment down below with the words, "And no retreat," to show your solidarity with the Freeport Fleet. Your engagement is the fuel that keeps this channel alive, allowing us to produce these massive, highly detailed 40-minute emotional journeys every single week. Subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you don't miss a single beat of the ultimate climax. Now let us return to the center of the Iron Wall, where Victoria Montgomery is about to unleash a secret that will change the fate of the realm forever. Victoria looked at the heavy cream silk of her wedding dress, then looked up into Arthur's eyes, a cold, brilliant smile breaking across her face. We don't need the harbor, Commander. Because the High Chancellor forgot one very important detail about my father's shipping contracts. The iron wall of shields groaned under a fresh assault as royal guards threw their weight against the iron plates. Outside, Chancellor Vance's voice had degenerated into an unhinged, frantic shriek, demanding more axes, more crossbows, more blood. The ancient cathedral, once a symbol of divine sanctuary, had become a pressure cooker of smoke, splintered mahogany, and the terrifying heavy thud of military steel. Inside the narrow, hot perimeter of the phalanx, Victoria stood perfectly still, the brilliant fire in her eyes cutting through the dim shadow of the interlocking shields. What detail, Victoria? Arthur Pendleton asked, his deep voice dropping to a low, hyper-focused register. He leaned closer to her, his massive frame shielding her father from a sudden shower of stone dust as another iron bolt shattered a corbel above their heads. The city garrison is locking down every street leading to the main wharves. Even if my men carry your father, we cannot cross 2 miles of open territory under fire. We don't need the main wharves, Arthur, Victoria said, her voice ringing with an absolute, terrifyingly calm intelligence. She reached down, her fingers confidently tearing away the heavy, encumbering silk train of her wedding gown, freeing her movements with a sharp, decisive rip. 6 years ago, when the High Chancellor drafted the city's tax exemption charters for my father's company, he insisted on classifying the ancient subterranean aqueducts beneath this cathedral as municipal property to avoid giving us storage rights. A sudden, brilliant realization flashed across Arthur's features, his gray eyes widening as he caught the trajectory of her mind. The old drainage tunnels. They lead directly from the cathedral crypts to the deep-water foundations of the Old South Pier. Exactly, Victoria said, a cold, triumphant smile touching her lips. Vance thought he was being clever by denying us commercial access above ground. But he forgot that my father's engineering crew was hired to map those exact vaults 40 years ago. There is a hidden structural gate right beneath the main altar, leading to a private subterranean channel. And docked at the end of that channel, hidden beneath the floor of the South Pier, is my father's personal steam tender, the Aegis. It doesn't use the main harbor lanes. It runs on high-pressure boilers through the underwater reef channels. Arthur let out a low, rumbling laugh of absolute admiration, a sound of pure, unadulterated hope that completely shattered the grim despair of the siege. He looked at the woman standing before him, her white gown stained with charcoal and stone dust, her face fierce with the light of a general who had just discovered the enemy's fatal vulnerability. "You didn't just plan a wedding, Victoria," Arthur whispered, his eyes burning with an intense, fierce devotion that made her heart skip a beat. "You mapped an invasion route." "I told you, Commander," Victoria replied, her voice steady and unyielding as she reached out, her hand locking firmly with his. "I am an expert on contracts. And I always ensure there is an escape clause." Arthur turned instantly, his commanding presence reasserting itself with an electric, unstoppable energy. He slammed his fist against the central shield of his lead sergeant. "Sergeant! Shift the phalanx. We are moving backward toward the crypt stairs behind the choir stalls. Drop the defensive wall on my mark. Execute a controlled retreat down the stairs, and seal the iron gates behind us." "Sir, yes, sir," the sergeant roared. The transition was a masterclass in military discipline. The Sovereign Guard didn't just retreat, they weaponized their movement. On Arthur's sharp command, the front line of shields violently surged forward, executing a synchronized crushing thrust that smashed into the front line of the Royal Guards, sending a dozen armored men flying backward into the shattered pews in a chaotic heap of iron and limbs. Before the Chancellor's forces could recover their footing, the phalanx swiftly reformed, moving backward in perfect rhythmic precision toward the heavy iron gate that led down into the dark, vaulted chambers of the ancient crypts. High Chancellor Vance, seeing his prey suddenly slipping toward the shadows behind the altar, let out a strangled, desperate scream. "No. Stop them. They are going to the vaults. Bring up the black powder charges. Blow the stairs. Do not let that girl reach the dark." William Darcy watched them go, his pale, sweat-slicked face frozen in a look of profound, agonizing emptiness. As Victoria stepped over the threshold of the crypt stairs, she cast one final cold glance back into the ballroom cathedral. She saw William cowering behind the altar, a slave to his own fear. She saw Catherine weeping in the ruins of her pride, and she saw the High Chancellor unraveling in his own web of corruption. They belonged to the dying world. She belonged to the future. Before we witness the breathless high-stakes escape through the ancient dark beneath the city, and see how Victoria and Arthur launch an international blockade that will bring the entire kingdom to its knees, let's take a quick moment together. The tide has officially turned, the brilliant counterstrike has begun, and true love is guiding our heroes out of the trap. If your heart is pounding with absolute joy right now, please take a second to hit that subscribe button immediately. Leave a comment down below with the word escape, so I know you're running down those crypt stairs right alongside Victoria and Arthur. Your incredible support is what allows us to dedicate the immense time and energy required to craft these massive, deeply detailed 40-minute emotional journeys every single week. Subscribe right now and join our growing family. Now, let us plunge into the ancient dark beneath the basilica, where the Shadow Bride is about to become the architect of a new dawn. Arthur Pendleton lifted Victoria's father onto his broad shoulders with effortless strength, his left hand remaining firmly locked with Victoria's as they hurried down the steep, winding stone steps into the absolute dark, while the heavy iron gates of the crypt slammed shut behind them with a definitive, thunderous crash. The damp, ancient stone walls of the subterranean aqueduct rushed past them in a blur of moss-covered granite and flickering torchlight. Above ground, the distant, muffled thud of black powder explosions shook the vaulted ceilings, raining centuries-old dust down upon the cold water swirling around Victoria's ankles. But the iron fortress had shifted from defensive to offensive. The Sovereign Guard moved like a shadow-armored serpent through the darkness, their boots splashing in perfect, unbroken rhythm as they cleared the path toward the South Pier. Victoria did not look back. Her torn cream silk dress, now dark with the water and soot of the underground channels, dragged behind her like the discarded skin of a past life. She kept her grip locked onto Arthur Pendleton's hand, her fingers drawing strength from his unyielding warm pressure. Ahead of them, the low, deep rumble of high-pressure marine boilers began to vibrate through the cavern walls, the unmistakable industrial heartbeat of the Aegis. "We're running out of time, Victoria," Arthur said, his deep baritone cutting through the roar of the rushing water as he effortlessly carried her father across a collapsed stone archway. "The city garrison has started dropping iron grates into the primary aqueduct junctions. If we don't clear the coastal outlet in 3 minutes, they will drop the harbor chain and pin us against the reef." "They won't drop the chain, Arthur," Victoria said, her breath coming in sharp, determined gasps as they rounded the final stone turn, bursting out into a massive hidden cavern beneath the rotted timbers of the Old South Pier. "Because the port captain answers to the Maritime Treasury, and his payroll was drawn from the very accounts I froze 10 minutes ago. The harbor master hasn't been paid since noon. He won't lift a finger for a bankrupt chancellor." Before them lay the Aegis. It was not a delicate pleasure yacht. It was an industrial masterpiece. A sleek, armored steam tender forged from dark iron and reinforced steel, its twin smokestacks hissing with a violent white cloud of high-pressure steam. The crew, wearing the dark wool of the Montgomery shipping line, stood ready at the lines, their faces grim but resolute as they saw their young heiress emerge from the dark. "Cast off." Arthur's voice boomed through the cavern, a command that sent the crew into immediate, frantic motion. He carefully placed Arthur Montgomery onto the deck's plush velvet berth, where the old man was instantly attended to by the ship's medical officer. Arthur turned back to the gangway, offering his hand to Victoria as she stepped aboard the iron deck. The moment her feet touched the timber, the heavy steam pistons groaned, the massive propellers biting into the deep water of the reef channel with a savage, roaring force that propelled the Aegis out from beneath the pier and into the open, blinding light of the bay. The sight that greeted them on the water made the breath catch in the throat of every pursuing soldier on the shore. The harbor was not empty. Laying anchor just outside the territorial 3-mile limit was the absolute crushing weight of the Freeport fleet. 30 massive, steel-hulled warships sat in a perfect, terrifying crescent formation across the mouth of the bay, their massive gun turrets gleaming under the afternoon sun, their flags billowing in the wind. They had not arrived to negotiate. They had arrived to execute a total ironclad international blockade. From the cliffs above, High Chancellor Julian Vance stood at the parapet of the citadel, his crimson robes torn, his face distorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness as he looked through a brass spyglass. He saw the Aegis slipping effortlessly through his fingers, cutting across the blue water toward the flagship of the free ports. He saw his kingdom entirely cut off from the global markets, his treasuries empty, his laws worthless, and his power shattered by a single merchant girl who refused to be a pawn. Beside him, William Darcy fell to his knees on the stone dirt, clutching his head as the royal guard stepped forward to arrest him for his family's ancient treason. The chancellor had no more use for secrets. In his ruin he was dragging every puppet down with him. Victoria stood at the bow of the Aegis, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face as the iron ship crossed the boundary into foreign sovereign waters. Arthur stepped up directly behind her, his large arms wrapping around her waist, his chest pressing against her back in a gesture of absolute protection and shared victory. The battle for the cathedral was over. The war for the kingdom had just been won without firing a single shot. The merchant's daughter had not just escaped the trap, she had bought the maze. Before we step into the breathtaking, emotional final act where Victoria and Arthur finally look toward a future filled with love, recovery, and limitless potential, let's take one last urgent moment together. This has been an absolutely epic journey of resilience, truth, and the ultimate victory of intellect over corrupt bloodlines. If you are cheering out loud for Victoria right now, please hit that subscribe button immediately. Leave a comment down below with the word triumph, so we can celebrate this beautiful, massive payoff together. Your subscriptions are what allow us to dedicate the time and energy to craft these incredibly deep, emotional 40-minute scripts for you every single week. Join our amazing community right now so you never miss a single masterpiece. Now let us step into the final sunset of this journey, where a beautiful new beginning is waiting to unfold for the woman who conquered the storm. Victoria looked up at Arthur, her eyes shining with a deep, emotional warmth that completely melted away the icy resolve she had maintained all afternoon. The battlefield had been cleared. The debt had been paid. Her father's soul was finally at peace, and her own heart was wide open, ready to receive the love she had denied herself for so long. "Let's go home, Arthur," Victoria whispered softly, her voice filled with a profound sense of peace. Arthur smiled, a beautiful, genuine expression of pure devotion, and escorted her toward the captain's bridge as the flagship of the Freeport fleet fired a grand, thunderous 21-gun salute to honor the arrival of their new queen. The thunderous echo of the warship's 21-gun salute rolled across the surface of the bay, a magnificent roaring declaration that the old order had collapsed and a new era had officially begun. As the Aegis pulled alongside the massive iron-ribbed hull of the Freeport's flagship, the oppressive weight of the kingdom, the cathedral, and the suffocating web of aristocratic deceit completely evaporated into the salt air. Victoria stood at the railing of the upper deck, her fingers lightly gripping the polished brass. A gentle ocean breeze swept over her, carrying away the lingering scent of burning black powder and damp crypts. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, letting the cool, clean air fill her lungs. For 2 agonizing years she had been walking a tightrope, suspecting that beneath William's grand promises lay a dark, hidden currents of manipulation. Now the truth was out, the trap had been shattered, and she was finally, completely free. She opened her eyes to find Arthur Pendleton standing beside her, his long wool cloak catching the wind. The fierce, terrifying commander who had just threatened a kingdom was gone, replaced by a man whose gray eyes were filled with a quiet, profound tenderness that made Victoria's heart swell with an organic warmth she had never felt before. "Your father is sleeping, Victoria," Arthur said, his deep baritone dropping to a gentle, reassuring register. "The medical officer has stabilized his leg and the sea air is already doing him good." He looked at the fleet before he closed his eyes. He knew his life's work was safe. Victoria turned to him, her torn, soot-stained cream gown rustling against the deck. A radiant, breathless smile broke across her face. A smile of pure, unadulterated triumph that completely illuminated the dusk falling over the water. "He didn't just save his fleet, Arthur. He saved his dignity. For so long, the High Chancellor made us feel like we were just guests in this realm, commoners who should be grateful for the crumbs falling from the noble tables. But today we proved that empires aren't inherited by bloodlines. They are built by minds. And your mind is the greatest treasure the sea has ever seen," Arthur replied, his voice rich with an intense, unyielding devotion. He stepped closer, his large hands reaching out to warmly envelop hers, lifting them gently to his lips. He didn't look at her as a merchant's daughter or as a pawn in a political chess game. He looked at her as his absolute equal, a sovereign force who had rewritten the destiny of the Freeports with a single stroke of a pen. The depth of their connection had not been born from shallow ballroom courtships or forced arranged alliances. It had been forged over months of midnight letters, shared risk, and a mutual hunger for absolute justice. Arthur had spent a decade fighting the corruption of the royal court from the outside. Victoria had dismantled it from the inside. Together they were an unstoppable force. "Where will we go now, Victoria?" Arthur asked softly, his eyes locking onto hers with a promise that stretched far beyond the horizon. "The High Chancellor is ruined, the Duke is in chains, and the King will be forced to sign our trade sovereignty treaties by morning to lift the blockade. The world is yours. Where do you want to begin?" Victoria looked out toward the endless open sea, where the setting sun was painting the water in brilliant strokes of gold, crimson, and violet. She felt no lingering pain from the betrayal at the altar, no humiliation from the whispers of the peerage. The shadow bride was dead. The true architect of the Freeports had stepped into the light. "Let's sail east, Arthur," Victoria said, her voice clear, confident, and ringing with an absolute sense of peace. She turned back to him, her hand slipping effortlessly into his, their fingers locking together in a silent, permanent vow. "We have new routes to map, new ports to build, and a lifetime of shared future to conquer. Together." Arthur smiled, a beautiful, genuine expression of pure, unadulterated love, and pulled her into a tight, protective embrace as the flagship turned its bow toward the golden horizon, sailing forward into a beautiful, limitless new dawn. The end.